Heard in the previous session relating to the dire humanitarian situation, but also a lot of mention of the need to sort of transition from immediate emergency aid to more sustainable development aid. This has been the case in many conflicts in the region and around the world that extend beyond a few months, that it becomes a challenge of sustainability, of development. Goes beyond immediate assistance. We're trying in this session to answer a number of questions relating to development aid or development agenda in and for Yemen. What have we learned from past attempts at development aid in Yemen? What can be done in terms of development planning and development assistance while the crisis continues before an end is found to it? What pillars exist on which to build an assistance program? What functions? Where can we start? How can we coordinate between local, regional, and international actors to be more effective? Perhaps even what are we learning from other conflicts in the region, whether Syria or further afield, as to how this might be done? We have two speakers for this session. I'm going to give each a bit more than the 10 minutes given to other panels, since we have only two speakers on this panel. The first is to my right, Jihan Abdel Ghaffar. Dr. Abdel Ghaffar is an international development expert. She worked previously in a number of functions with the UNDP, with the British DFID in Yemen, with the UN Development Fund for Women. She has also currently been serving as an advisor, a senior advisor to the executive director of the World Bank as relates to World Bank thinking on Yemen. She does not represent the bank, nor is she here in that capacity. She's here in her personal capacity as an expert. To my left is Mr. Robert Wilson. Mr. Wilson is the Policy and Program Coordination Division Chief, Near Eastern Affairs Bureau, Assistance Coordination Office at the U.S. Department of State. So we're going to hear from both their views on these issues before opening it up for a discussion. So, Jihan.
Well, thank you, Paul, and I'm really honored to be here with you today. Sorry. So as Paul mentioned, I'm here in my personal capacity. I do not represent the World Bank Group or any of the countries that my chair represented the board of directors at the bank. So the questions that were basically asked, or the things that we do need to reflect on during this session based on some of the lessons learned. And I just want to make sure that we have some context to it. The situation now in Yemen is much, much, much more complicated than they were when these lessons were generated. You know, there was a humanitarian crisis even before the conflict. Now the situation is worse. The poverty rates doubled, almost doubled. The malnutrition worse in the world. And I know that my colleagues talked about the humanitarian side of it earlier, so I'm not going to go into details on that. But I think one of the worst things that happened in this war was the damage to the social fabric. And so no matter what we try to do, building infrastructure is the easiest part. It's building social cohesion that we really need a different way of thinking and approach. There is also the collapse of many services, and we see how Yemen, is trying to cope with the cholera, and part of it is the health system and the collapse of the health system, especially in certain areas. There are also new challenges in Yemen that were not there in the same magnitude as they are now. One of them is the forcibly displaced. Now we have almost 2+ million of internally displaced people that will need to be addressed going forward, and how to help them reintegrate back to their lives and support them. There is also the issue of children and soldiers that will also need somehow to be addressed going forward. So it is going to take time, even if the conflict stopped today. It's going to take time, resources, and commitment to go back even to the same level of development trajectory that Yemen was there before the crisis. So, we do need to manage expectations of how quick things will change on the ground. So in terms of the lesson learned, I think one of the things that was somehow successful to some extent is at least that the national development plans in Yemen did integrate poverty alleviation policies. Where the problem was is that it was not nested in the national budget. So we did have policies. For example, we did have the local authority law, the 2000 local authority law, which was, somehow a good law. But then there's no fiscal decentralization. So there is that gap between the policies, the laws, and resources. I think one lesson that was very useful even for us now is the effort that was made to provide sustained support to national institutions. It really paid off. It paid off that now we have the social development fund. We have the public work projects. So the more we invest in local institutions, it really paid off later on, and especially in time of crisis. So we do need to invest in resilient institutions. We also, one of the things that we need to learn from is how to capture local grievances in our development effort. And also look at the private sector. I think the public sector cannot generate jobs. We know that. But how much did we do to get the private sector, develop the private sector? Even, and I'm talking about the old days. For example, we don't even have a PPP law in place. So how are we gonna encourage our private sector to provide jobs and development in the country and growth? There was a limited absorptive capacity. There will continue to be a limited absorptive capacity later on. The question is, we should go beyond discussing of the what needs to be done, but how to do it within the capacity that's available on the ground. So we do need to be realistic. And I always refer to the Murphy Law, that things will go wrong if it's possible, and we do need to be prepared for it. There's also a lack of coordination even among local institutions at that point, and now it's going to be even more complicated. There should also be a balance between the political processes and the economic growth in the country. And if we look back at the national dialogue, for example, the focus was around that time during the national dialogue, and I see the ambassadors there, but there was a lot of excitement, and there should have been a lot of excitement about the political process, but in parallel, there was not enough support to the economic growth in the country. So the people's livelihood was deteriorating, but there was this also high expectation of the national dialogue, but we do need to keep that balance going forward. There's also the inflated expectation, and that comes after every big event, the revolution, the end of conflict in certain areas. And if they're not met, then they will create more frustration and it will create more, I don't want to say violence, but conflict going forward. So for the donor side, in the past, there was a gap between pledges and disbursement. So we always go to these conferences where we hear these big numbers, and the people in the country think really when the government comes back, they're already carrying this money in their suitcases, and then things doesn't happen, and frustration. Oh, where's this money? Is this corruption? Is this? But we do need to recognize that, especially in situation of conflict or fragility, we do need to be agile. Donors need to be as agile as everybody else, and meet their commitments. They also, donors in general, they have their own implementing modalities. So each one of them come with their own monitoring policies, they have their procurement policies, and you already know that there is a limited capacity on the ground. So how can donors work together to come up with modalities that will capture what's on the ground and help the country implement their programs. There's also the need to simplify projects going forward. It's good to have this, sophisticated, complicated programs, but if they're not implemented, then we're losing on them. And also create or design programs with more of a complex sensitivity lenses. What if? Today things might be good. What if things didn't work? And this has happened when the conflict happened. Everybody pulled out. And most of the projects in the country stopped because they were not complex sensitive. There was no thinking, if tomorrow we're not able to be present in the country, who could help, who could take over? And it took time for development agencies to stop and say, okay, maybe there's another way to do it. And it took the bank some time, but it did re-engage in the country through the UN, so it was a good cooperation, but it was, that thinking that should have been taken to happen before the conflict even happened, knowing that the situation was already very fragile in the first place. So in terms of what development approach is now, I think I agree with a previous speaker who said we cannot wait. Things need to happen now. And it should be people-focused development. People resilience has been stretched so thin, and they need as much help as possible, help to meet their immediate needs. Paying salary for civil servants, their purchasing power is very, very low now. If, people are in debt, and it's not sustainable. And if we're using this as a way to say, oh, people revolt tomorrow or whatever, and then we're going to get a solution, it's proven, this theory proven not to work. So in fact, when you see that people are still going to their works, that's a resilience, that's a resistance, and that needs to be supported. Also providing the salaries for people will enhance the credibility of the government, because at the end of the day, it's the government that's responsible of the people, not anybody else. So that will enhance the legitimacy of the government and maintain trust in institution. It will also preserve the institution. We don't want to lose our teachers. We don't want to lose our doctors. We do need to have our institution operating and providing services to the people. It's also about social protection programs. We do need to keep those going, even if they're not making, a big bang in the country, in terms of the livelihood of people, but it does help. And the bank is now working on reviving the social protection program. It's also important to preserve the functionality of our institutions and preserve them as much as we could. Central Bank of Yemen needs to be supported. If this is the only way to be able to get our private sector to operate, our country to be able to function again, we can't do it without a strong CBY. And CBY will need to work with all the branches all over the country. So they need to find a mechanism that they work together. Also focus on people's livelihood and creating economic activities. And that's one of the things why the bank re-engaged. It was one of them to support the resilience of institutions like the SFD and PWP. But it was also to create this kind of helping the livelihood of, supporting the livelihood of people through labor-intensive projects and other things. So, when you don't have a private sector that's operating in an optimal way, and you don't have salaries for the public sector, where the money is going to come for the people? They might be recruited for other things. You really don't want that. Nobody wants that. So it's always better to find ways to re-engage people in more positive things, especially in a country that as young as the Yemeni society. There is also the need to bridge the gap between humanitarian and development. I always remember this story from an African country, which I can't remember the name of that country, but it was interesting that there was this humanitarian assistance to a refugee camp where a lot of money was given to buy water. By the end of the year, the cost of that money would have built a small water project in the area that would have served the refugees and the host community. So I think whenever we're trying to do humanitarian work or development work, they need to sit together and start to find a way that how can we provide the needs for the people now, the immediate needs, but also keep in mind that we don't forget that there is a forest out there, that we need to keep that in mind. Also, it's important to bring the security aspect to it. We cannot do humanitarian development work without looking at the security and the safety of people. So how can we bring those three together? So today you had a session on humanitarian, a session on development. I wish there was another one on security and safety of people in the country. Also, the golden hour is critical. We do need to prepare for, hopefully, and we all hope that the conflict will end as we speak, but we need to prepare for it. And as much analytical work could be done now, as much as development partners are engaged in the country, that helps later on, because this is now is when the lessons learned, the real lessons learned, are happening that could be identified and implemented later on. And the more that there are joint assessments among development partners, so we don't end up with conflicting approaches later on, with each one of the development partners having their own assessment. So the more we have that, the better. We had the damage needs assessment, for example, that was done by the bank, the UN, and the Islamic Development Bank. So, you know, things like this will help to get us ready for the next steps. There are also now what they call it the blueprint that the bank is drafting and in consultation with the government. But there are also others now are commenting on it, and it's becoming more of hopefully it's a living document that still will always keep updated, but it brings everybody together, hopefully, into having at least a vision of what to do now and how we could respond going forward. I think the collaboration between the bank and the UN proved that if there is a will, there is a way. The bank bended its rules to operate in Yemen. It's the first time that the bank is working in a country that is in active conflict, using the country's resources, and putting even more resources than it was allocated for Yemen if situation was the old normal. And I think that hopefully that will also encourage others to join the effort, because Yemen do need every single thing we could do right now. It's also important to understand that these international organizations or development partners, they work in Yemen, but Yemen also have commitments toward them. They have obligations. For example, Yemen has that to the international development assistance under the bank. If Yemen does not pay on a monthly basis their commitment, the bank will pull out. And that's something, a risk that we're living through it every single day. And the question is, who could help to take that burden on Yemen? At least to make sure that these development partners are able to operate in Yemen, continue operating in Yemen. So we do need to have a mechanism to address this financial obligations that the countries have. So going forward, I think it's very important to have peace dividends. People need to see that their life improved as soon as conflict at least has been managed to a certain level. We need to have stabilization in the macroeconomy. Hopefully, some donors will be very generous to put some money in our reserves, so at least we could be able to import things into the country. The IFC created a trade facility with 100 million from the Saudis. More is needed. They're still developing the facility itself, but it's a way to help, but it's not the only way. The best thing is to get the institutions themselves in Yemen to be able to do these functions as normally as possible. We also need to be realistic and to be willing to take risks as much as we could, and to operate within the observative capacity available in the country, to also to understand that the legitimacy of the local institution will always be challenged. And the only way to work with them is to improve their capacity and the resilience. Also, we do need to look into more inclusive policies. to enhance the legitimacy of institutions, to provide jobs for the people, and to improve the overall living standards of the Yemenis. Also investing in human development. We do need to continue investing in human development, whether it's now or later. We need to avoid having a lost generation, because the impact of that will live with us for very, very long. We're already having almost, I think, 2 million children out of school, if I remember the numbers right. And this is going to be a challenge going forward for Yemen if those kids are not back to school, or find a way for them to get, to go back basically to school. Of course, increasing the participation of women and youth. Now with the in conflict in many countries, and Yemen is one of them, we see an increase of female head of households. That changed the way our economy will structure itself, and how those women, who basically many of them lack skills, marketable skills, how are they going to support their families? We do need to have special approaches to them to help them out, whether de-risking investments for them or find a way, but we do need to work in a different approaches and have a directed programs to help them and to engage them in the whole process, both women, youth, and other vulnerable groups, in the planning, implementation, and monitoring of whatever we're trying to do. Also working with civil society, and as much as we could to revive the private sector in Yemen, and as I said before, building social cohesion. But also one thing that we also need to keep in mind, that the diaspora played an important role in the development of Yemen. The remittances always been very important for Yemen economy, and the question is how we could get the diaspora re-engaged again in Yemen the way that they were able to do in the past. I'm a Yemeni American, and I have difficulty sending money back to Yemen. It's really difficult. So how can we work together, either create a diaspora fund or something that I feel like if I send money to Yemen, nobody will knock at my door the next day and say, who did you send the money to? So, so we do need to work around that and find a way to deal with that. Okay.
Thank you very much. Very rich, very detailed, a lot of food for thought and questioning. Thank you for that, Jihan. I'll turn to Mr. Wilson. And perhaps also after Mr. Wilson, we'll turn, Mr. Ambassador, if you can make some comments about these issues as well. Thank you, Robert.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And thank you to the Middle East Institute for this important meeting. It's very important to keep focus on Yemen and its crisis. And we really appreciate the opportunity to participate. Up until about 2 years ago, the U.S. government and USAID in particular had a robust program of development support in Yemen, which was largely framed under the GCC agreement. It included support for the national dialogue process, constitutional reform, governance, security, and other structural reforms, and it also provided support for development programs. There was a great deal of international buy-in at the time. It was a very exciting period of time in Yemen. And it was strongly endorsed by an election referendum by the Yemeni people in late 2000 or early 2012. And it was, again, a special time to be in Yemen and to witness the enthusiasm of the people there. A donor conference later that year brought Yemenis and international donors and their international partners together in a detailed transitional planning process. It identified key stabilization priorities, actions for restoring governance, the provision of security and safety for the populations, macroeconomic stability measures, economic recovery, as well as humanitarian actions. The plan ran parallel to the political process that was going on with the national dialogue and the other political transition benchmarks that were envisioned. It received commitments or pledges, I should say, of several $billion. A mutual accountability framework was established to identify and track the progress of political measures, policy measures, and program actions. And again, we all felt extremely enthusiastic about that, and we were solidly behind the initiatives. But despite our efforts to make it inclusive, responsive, and action-oriented, it failed for a number of reasons. The question today is, what can we learn from this experience, and what can we identify to do correctly the next time? As Jihan pointed out, there was, under this transition plan, a broad range of priorities and projects, which in its defense reflected the broad set of needs in Yemen, but proved to be way too broad to manage and to handle. In retrospect, the plan needed to be better focused, sequenced, driven by local priorities, considerate of the implementation and absorptive capacities that we were faced with, and prospects for sustainability. With respect to the management of the effort, an executive bureau to facilitate aid absorption was set up to work closely with counterpart ministries and donors. It was challenged initially by staffing, and then the range of design, implementation, and funding mobilization issues became somewhat problematic. It had a coordination function which brought together donors and government, but its ability to engage at the local level and down to the grassroots to kind of understand really what was necessary for the local populations was somewhat of an issue. On the programmatic side, there was some question as to whether we focused sufficiently on the capacities of local organizations like the Social Development Fund and the Public Works programs, which had deep roots in local economies. And the question was whether we adequately supported them as opposed to focusing on donor preferred mechanisms. Also, partnerships with the private sector may not have received sufficient attention that they deserved. The private sector's role in food security, investment, employment, and wages is broadly understood and acknowledged now, perhaps more so than it was back then in 2012, 2013. On the funding side, while there appeared to be sufficient funding available, like you said, the suitcases coming back to Sana'a, it was disjointed, it was earmarked, it was reserved for special projects. Big donors had their investment programs, smaller donors had their work with, ongoing work with NGOs and international organizations. It was not flexible enough to meet the priorities that were identified. We also know that humanitarian development and private sector actors faced security issues, even back then. It was non-permissive and insecure to get around the country, and that's worse, much worse today. At the end of the day, the transition plan faltered in large measure due to these factors. The lack of visible progress that we had under this transition plan contributed to dissatisfaction with the political process, the national dialogue, and the constitutional deliberations. People needed to feel that their needs were being met and see tangible progress under the political transition, as well as this transition plan for recovery and reconstruction. But the results did not occur at the necessary scope, the speed, and the scale that the people expected. And we can learn considerably from this prior experience in Yemen and address the daunting, even more daunting challenges that the country faces today. As Jihan mentioned, planning is currently underway for a new wave of stabilization, recovery, and reconstruction efforts. In consultation with donors, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the World Bank have led the development of a draft blueprint for Yemen, which includes stabilization, recovery, and reconstruction, estimates and proposals. The price tag is nothing to scoff at, estimating needing $17 billion per year, $88 billion for a 5-year period. Physical asset reconstruction alone is at $25 billion. It would be possible to start elements of this blueprint even under the current crisis conditions. In addition to humanitarian assistance, which is extremely important, it proposes mechanisms to get money into the hands of Yemenis that aren't served by humanitarian programs. As we all know, there is a huge cash deficiency in Yemen. People can't afford to buy food or services. Financing is important through income support programs, Social Fund for Development, other cash transfer programs, providing funding for the commercial transactions that are so necessary to sustain the economy. The blueprint does indeed recommend a social welfare fund, a trade finance facility, financing for salaries and critical inputs for farmers and domestic production, support to restore social protection systems, health and education systems, services and local infrastructure for recovery. And local institutions figure prominently into the blueprint, which is a good thing. Later stages, it would focus on strengthening institutional capacities to broaden economic recovery and sustain growth. The plan also recognizes the refinements and corrections that must be taken over previous plans, it's a good read, and I hope it's available publicly here shortly. It would focus on building greater citizen trust. It would address local and sectoral needs primarily. It would be more selective in terms of program focus rather than have a broad range of program interventions ranging from infrastructure to services to human capacity development, all of those things which are extremely important. It would help to prioritize what is needed initially, and I think they pinpointed the need to get cash into the hands of Yemenis to begin to fuel and jumpstart the economy back to where it needs to go. It would seek greater funding flexibility, which is an important lesson we've learned from other countries that we can talk about later. And it would have to address implementation capacities that have been depreciated or diminished over the past several years. Physical capital is not available as it was before. Human capital, of course, needs to be rebuilt. So we have to be realistic in what the plan can accomplish and careful as to how to execute it with local capacity considerations in mind. And also, as was mentioned, security is sine qua non for any kind of development efforts to take root. And strong donor coordination and participation will be necessary, as well as dedicated local leadership. I think, if I might say, back in 2012, 2013, there was there's a great deal of focus on the political process, which was extremely important. That same kind of level and degree and intensity of focus needs to be placed on the development and recovery side to make this plan work. We will continue to work with the international community and proactively plan recovery efforts, and while also learning of the shortcomings and shortfalls that initiatives have faced over the past several years. There are some interesting stabilization and recovery activities going on in Iraq, I think, that we can learn from. Different case altogether, of course. But the planning efforts that went into the campaign in Mosul, for example, occurred several months, if not a year plus, in advance before that operation. They were prepared with a plan that was phased go in with security measures, with demining, with the clearance of explosive devices that could affect the recovery, with stabilization assistance that functioned with multi-donor funded baskets of resources. As we think about how to move forward under this blueprint, I think we need to consider that experience in Iraq. And of course, we're looking for diverse Yemeni participation in this, not only at the central level, but at the local level. I think, again, the lesson that we learned, it was hard to get around back then, let's be honest. It was not easy for teams to mobilize and head down to Aden or to Lahaj and into other parts of the country, the interior parts of the country, to have extensive discussions with local communities and develop plans that both they could be comfortable with and donors could support, and that could be supported with local institutions, including government institutions. But that's really what's required. We need to have an effort that's going to get down to the grassroots, work with people to address their needs. And if we do so, then political processes that are rejuvenated, revitalized, hopefully soon, will have much more credibility, much more buy-in by the local population, and much more success. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Let me turn to the ambassador for a few comments, and then we'll open for discussion.
First of all, if you allow me, just I have a few comments, from the previous panel. I want to reassure that, the Yemeni government, we do believe that the only solution for the Yemeni crisis is the, peaceful settlement. So we do believe this is how we can, gain sustainable peace, in Yemen. As we repeated that all the time, this war it wasn't our choice. It was, imposed in us, and we are, doing our best to find a way for, to reach the peace. Secondly, I think also we do care about all our people from Saada to Mahra, from Ta'az to Marib to everywhere, and I think we will not accept by anyhow to use the economical instruments as a punishment for our people. I think either the salaries issues or the port issues, whatever. I think we have to agree on that. Regarding the development aspects and issues, and I think the main message that we delivered all the time, and we are keeping delivering the same message that don't wait until we reach political settlement, because all the times I had a lot of meetings at the USAID, many donors, they said we cannot, act now, we cannot do anything, until you reach political settlement, and they said no. We need you now. If you are not with us now, we will not need you later on. This is the time that we need to see our friends, our brothers, shoulder to shoulder with us. We need to see them, and the many people need to see hope in the future. I think it's pity. I'm struggling to get just the scholarship for Yemeni students to get them just visas. Some of them that will be sponsored by the Yemeni government or by other foundations, and we are not able, and they are the top graduates. So just to get visa for them, and to get some scholarship or partial scholarship for them. So I think we have yesterday, not today. We have to act. We have to start and be creative. How we can operate some of our operation either in Yemen. Most of them will come in the liberated areas, and also in Sana'a, anywhere, any place that you can serve the Yemeni people. I think we as Yemeni government will facilitate your job. Secondly, I think it's very important to building the capacity and dealing directly with the constitutional institution. Not creating another platforms. As you know, all of you talking about the pressure, make more pressure. Sometimes, unfortunately, the pressure on the wrong side, as we had before with the central bank issues. So, I think the only way is to save the life of Yemeni people is to, restore the state, building the capacity of the institutions in Yemen. Any institutions, we will come dealing directly with the social the welfare with the صندوق التنمية الاجتماعية social fund. So any Yemeni institutions just build their capacities, deal with them directly, on the top, the Yemeni government and its institutions. Because sometimes some proposals made by the donors, they create, totally different channels. And instead of solving the problem, they try to create more problem for us in the near futures. Civil society organization, public sector, private sectors, triangles of development. So we have to, energize them. We have to build their capacity together, get them together, with the donors, just to make some difference on the ground. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. We're going to turn to Q&A and put your tent card vertically. If you want to ask a question, I'm going to take the privilege of the chair and ask a couple of opening questions. First, Jihan, and from the discussion, I mean, unlike the discussions in maybe the previous sessions, one gets the impression that even in a sense, though the state collapsed in terms of its ability to control territory, the bureaucracy in a way survives, institutions in a certain sense survive even though control is lost. Could you say a bit about whether from your work and following stuff in Yemen or being here working with international aid organizations that in the end are working with the state, even though it doesn't control much territory, with these different national institutions, as you called them, it gives hope that there is a backbone there, that there is something that can be helped, that it's not complete chaos and so on. Say a bit more about that, and if you could also comment on an issue that came up in the previous sessions, that there are some areas where the state, is in a political sense, and then there's areas, Houthi control and others where maybe the bureaucrats are there, but it's controlled by a non-state actor. How does that work, or how are the aid agencies dealing with that? Robert, I wanted to ask a couple of things. One, obviously we're following what has happened in Yemen, and you said, optimism and then pessimism and difficulty. And as Ambassador Chamberlain mentioned in the opening session, obviously Washington, US is going through its own process. And the question here is, sitting where you are, how do you see the funding prospects or risks from the US side? Do you see a risk to US participation and funding in the Yemen project? Obviously it impacts everything, but how do you see the US, whether it's Congress or the government budget, and would that also impact other partner funders in Europe and the US? And my second question, both of you have talked a lot about sort of the planning, the projects, the planning documents. Here we are in July 2017. What can you say about what is in the pipeline in August or September? Or what is happening? What's going to happen in the immediate future? So let's start with those, and then we'll turn to the audience. Jihan,
Thank you. Well, I think these are very important questions, how to deal with state and non-state actors now as this situation in Yemen. I think for the international organizations, I'm not in a position to speak on their behalf, but because the UN recognized the government as the internationally recognized government, so that's for them, the legitimate entity or political entity that they are having the dialogue with. However, and as you mentioned, Paul, that yeah, it could be the state, but then somehow the institutions as technocrats are still operating to serve the people of Yemen. And I think that's the most interesting part, because even when we discuss projects, for example, in Yemen, inputs comes from ministries in Sana'a through the legitimate government. So there is still the institutions as themselves, with all, the whatever we could say about them in the as observative capacity, as I think the reality on the ground, nobody could look the other side and say, well, I'm, this ministry in Sana'a wouldn't deal with somebody else. Or I think the reality on the ground made people realize that they do need to serve the people. But even if we look in the past in Yemen, before the war, Yemen was considered fragile, in fragile situations. Basically, the government was not able to provide services to all of Yemen. So the Yemeni people somehow learned to find ways to survive by themselves. Which that's why I said the legitimacy of the institutions will always be under question, will be challenged. But I think it's very important to realize that no matter what, tomorrow, if the situation's resolved, in one way or another, these are the institutions we will be dealing with. So if we pull back, if they are not in the picture of what's happening in terms of the planning, in terms of, they're not going to be implementing, because there's a fiduciary risk for many of these institutional organizations that will not allow, as we speak, money to go through these institutions. But as part of them being part of the planning and the thinking, you are protecting these institutions, because if they collapsed, the cost of reviving them will be very, very high. And if tomorrow things improved, we need these institutions. So although there is this political thing that it's very difficult to deal with, having a non-state actor, but still we do need to work with the technocrats there and try to neutralize the institution as much as we could, going forward.
Okay. Thank you, Jean.
Yes. Question was how do we see funding and risk fund, or the risks of funding from the U.S. side? I think, the U.S. does have funding for the Yemeni crisis. We've contributed, about $460 million to the humanitarian crisis just this year. This is not a problem unique to the United States, but we do have what they call pipeline of funds that have not been spent or moved over the past couple of years that we can draw on, and we're planning on drawing on in the near term. And we continue to get allocations from our congressional appropriators. It's great to hear that is it Senator Young is going to have the hearing tomorrow, or I think, yeah. It's great to hear that he and others are preoccupied with the Yemeni crisis and appear to be willing to do what they can to support. But what we've done currently in Yemen is to try to press as much as we possibly can the planning for broader coalitions of funding. This idea for the trade financing mechanism. We work very closely early on with the IFC on this, basing a lot of our impetus, motivation for this on conversations we've had with traders who were facing constraints in getting financing, and an understanding that that reserves were rapidly dwindling. And even if the Federal Reserve released, the $280 million it had frozen for Yemen, that represents a small portion of the overall annual financing requirements for the Yemeni economy, external financing requirements. So we have tried to build confidence in programs, program concepts, program plans, program designs, and work with our partners in generating financial interest. I think the results of a couple of recent donor conferences in Riyadh finally led to the Saudis, for example, saying, okay, well, get it in place and we might have $100 million for this trade financing facility. Work a little bit more on your ideas for social welfare fund, which we are doing, thanks to my colleague here next to me. Then the hope and the prospect for getting further assistance from donors beyond what the World Bank has generously offered already will carry that program until such time as the Yemen economy and its exports and its revenues from the exports kick in to support these kinds of programs. So risks, yes. The funding for such an enormous recovery stabilization effort is not there. But there's something there now that we can get started with and that we can mobilize amongst the donors. A big risk is not having credible, accountable, and verifiable programs that you would expect financiers or donors to support. So getting those in place is extremely important. In fact, we've wanted to pilot some of the social welfare fund activities up front and to generate information on how those pilot activities went in the current circumstances so that we can encourage other donors to ante up. The U.S. will have a role, but I think our secretary has made it clear that it's got to be a coalition effort, and we're working very hard to kind of build coalitions for Yemen and for other countries.
Thank you, Robert. I have Ambassador Chamberlain, Charles Schmitz, David Ottaway's tent card kept going up and down. I'm not sure what that means.
My card should
Wendy.
probably have gone up and down too. Bob, welcome. It's just delighted to see you here at the Middle East Institute. As an old friend from my days at AID. I think you've already answered this question, but I'm a little dense, so let me ask it again. These are plans. These aren't programs that are in place. These are plans. Am I right? When the conflict subsides and we're able to get back in there, I know we don't have an embassy there now. Do we have an AID mission operating out of Jeddah? So we don't know how much money, and it isn't happening yet, but it'll happen someday. Okay, thanks.
I can specify that a little bit. Again, up until about two and a half years ago, we had a development program going on in Yemen. We had implementers. We were providing funds for stabilization operations, for small-scale community-driven infrastructure, for education, for health. That all came to a halt when the embassy evacuated and the aid program stopped, and we could not recommend our implementers to stay there. But there still is money, and there still are platforms through which we can implement, and we are now working to support those programs. We've got money going to UNICEF for for critical support to the health sector. We have money going to the Social Fund for Development for cash for work, livelihoods promotion activities, and we have a number of smaller NGO programs that are able to implement in some places of the country that are receiving our funding. In addition, we are going to work with the Social Welfare Fund, and we're going to work more fully with the Social Fund for Development, because those two vehicles, or those two platforms, again, are countrywide. They are capable institutions. They've got strong staff. There's been some diminution of their capacities, and again, they're faced with security issues as well. But we can work with them. So there are platforms that we can support.
Follow up on my own question, because a lot of the discussion this morning was to call on the international community to invest in Yemen. So we are. The United States is investing in the humanitarian and development issues. I just want to make that point. Secondly, one of the principles I know of development, good development, and you hear this all the time, which is a word I didn't hear at all today, and it kind of disturbs me, and that is the word inclusion. I mean, if we're going to give humanitarian aid, and if we're going to give development aid, it ought to be inclusive to all of the people of Yemen. Is that one of the principles that you're working on in these plans?
It is. In fact, yes, it is. The short answer, yes. We want to work with all Yemenis, all areas of the country, all political persuasions. But the problem is that it's impossible to do that. It's impossible to pay salaries for everybody. It's impossible to do projects everywhere in Yemen. It's impossible to reach everywhere in Yemen. So the question is, should that be an impediment to your action? Some would say, no, we have to do what we can, where we can, with whom we can. And that's an issue that we're working through. Of course, we want to be inclusive, but.
Thanks, Bob. Let's take a number of questions. Charles?
Yeah, I just wanted to... The numbers I was interested in, 25 billion for infrastructure, 88 billion over 5 years. The total GDP of Yemen is, I think, just around 30 or 35, okay? And the government's budget is about a quarter of GDP. The recent move of the bank to Aden, the Saudis promised 1 billion to back it up, to help the currency. They didn't deliver. The Saudis are the largest donors. You're operating under an Obama budget still. Trump's budget is 18. You're getting a 40% proposed cut. It hasn't gone through Congress, I realize. Where's this money going to come from? I mean, realistically.
Thank you, Charles. Hold those thoughts. We'll take a few questions. David, since you're right next door.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Wilson. This has been really... Thank you for enlightening us on what's going on this bank. My question is, and you kind of answered it, but why has it taken the U.S. so long to unfreeze Yemeni money at the Federal Reserve Bank? And how important is it to international donors to know whether the Aden Bank is going to become a national bank or the Bank of South Yemen? In other words, do donors really need to know whether we're watching the rebirth of South Yemen in order to start making contributions? How important is it to know what's the state you're dealing with? And is it 2 states or 1 state?
Thank you, David. John Duke.
Yes, to come back to the earlier question,
I know there's no microphone next to you, but we need to get you one. It's for the translation, so.
reiteration of my earlier question, which was not answered, and I would hope that you, Mr. Wilson, might address it, and it had to do with desalination. I had a partial answer at a break from a colleague here that there's a small one in Aden, but surely in your office you look at the broader number of countries in need, many of them with a water need. Why is it that desalination technology has not been reduced to make it cost effective, and therefore examples to be shown here and there to lift people's hopes, if not also their expectations? All of the technological things for the last half century have gone down in price, but that one, why?
Thank you. I'm going to go back to the board, and then we'll get Hanan and Qais's questions. A lot of questions to Mr. Wilson. It's beginning to sound like the movie Mr. Wilson's War, if you remember that.
Charlie.
Charlie Wilson's War.
Okay, I'll do my best. Where will the money come from? I guess the first question. I think the World Bank and Saudi blueprint is what it is, a blueprint. It's a aspirational as much as descriptive of the real actual cost if one were to address the problems adequately. We're going to do what we can with how much we are able to generate. There still are, even with pledges coming from various countries, there still are issues and constraints in moving that money. So we got to build momentum. We've got to open the gates, so to speak, so that people get used to supporting Yemen, get confident with it, are assured of the accountability measures. But you're right. It's reflective of a conflict that has set them back 10 years. It has destroyed infrastructure immeasurably, and this was a study that was done from afar, and if you go down to the grassroots and to the actualities, it might even be more than 22 billion. But we'll do what we can, and it's good to have that kind of plan and detail. The World Bank is and the UN and other donors commonly do these needs assessments, these damage needs assessments after conflict, to help frame the problems, and that's basically what it is. But you're right, it's going to be very difficult to reach those levels that are being spoken of. On the Central Bank of Yemen, I think there were valid concerns about the control and accountability and management functions of the central bank when it was moved down to Yemen or to Aden, and it is reasonable for the Federal Reserve to say before the money is released, we have questions, which they provided to the Yemenis, and the Yemenis are now addressing them. The State Department has provided its endorsement of the idea of freeing those assets or unfreezing those assets. But it's, from what I understand, it's still being worked on. But it's a good exercise because it requires the Yemeni managers at the central bank in Aden to deal with issues such as how are they going to deal with other branches, how are they going to integrate functions, how are they going to manage international, local transactions, how are they going to control monies that could fall into the hands of terrorists, how are they going to supervise banks and ensure that the money supplies foreign reserves and local currencies are balanced. I mean, it's a huge job, and the central banks, such as other institutions, has been you know, somewhat disrupted, to say the least. And it has to have that capacity. And we have support resources to help the central bank build up its management functions in those regards. So it might take some time. That's why the World Bank and the Saudis have suggested this interim export or import financing mechanism. Of course, they want to work with the central bank, but when it has fuller capacity. Now, with respect to whether it's going to be a southern-based bank or a separate, we're not looking at it that way. Our vision is that there will be a reintegrated Yemen. It makes sense. The central bank would be reintegrated. But even if they're not totally integrated at this point, they can become, we can work towards that. We can kind of hopefully motivate the parties to see the benefits, the dividends from peace by supporting development and recovery programs, supporting transition support programs such as support to the central bank, support cash transfers to the Yemeni government. And when people see that there is international interest in having Yemen recover, maybe that would be some incentive to return to the peace table and work together. But even if not, we'll have some things, a lot to do in Yemen, regardless. And desalinization, good project. Where there's salt water, it makes total sense. Makes sense in Hudaydah, makes sense in on the coast. The coast of Yemen is tremendous. It's got a lot of potential there. There are appropriate technologies that could be used at the village level, solar-driven technologies, solar-powered technologies that can be used for desalinization. We tried to work on that several years ago, and in Abiyan, when Abiyan was liberated from Al-Qaeda, water was an issue, and we had a couple of solar desalinization plants down there supplying water. The problem is in the mountainous regions, in Sana'a, which has been drawing its water from groundwater, even I don't know what the technical term is, even below normal groundwater, drawing supplies from that. So that has got to be addressed. There's some ingenious ways of collecting water that my colleagues to my left have worked on, and we worked on in a big way. If you ever get to the old town, you'll see a number of houses have got household collection systems with large cisterns built to collect water and supply families with water for some time. That's a possibility. It's already a technology that's been practiced by Yemenis for some time. But desalinization, I think, on the coast, for in the near term, and to ship water up to the highlands or the higher elevations like Taiz and Sana'a would take some investment, but it's possible. They're doing it in Jordan. We're working on a project to desalinize water in Jordan, which will be shared with the West Bank and Israel and Jordan, of course, and transport it. And the investment is huge, but it's absolutely necessary there and will be necessary in Yemen too. Sorry to take so much time.
No, thank you, Robert. Jihan, do you have some comment?
Yeah, just a quick thing on where is the money going to come from. I have the same question. This is the same, almost equal to the Yemen GDP before the crisis. I think the importance of having this kind of assessments, even if the figure we think it's very high and we don't know where is the money going to come from now, but it somehow contribute to the narrative that, we need to do something. There is hope, at least with the idea itself of what needs to be done, and then to bring everybody together to start working on it. Because so far, we don't have a political settlement in place. You know, we need all parties to come back to the negotiating table. As a Yemeni, I would like to see them coming back and start, you know, finding a way out of this. But we cannot just depend on that. We do need to send a message of hope to the people that, you know, there is a way to deal with the situation. We are trying to be ready as an international community. I think that's the importance of having these kind of assessments, and also to be prepared for the aftermath. But where is the money gonna come from? I think Yemen has been always struggling with getting the attention of the international community in comparison to other countries. You know, if we could take the Syrian refugees issue, for example, it's only when the boats arrived to Europe that everybody started talking about the refugees, because it came close to home. Yemen is so far. So we do need to bring the attention and keep bringing the attention of the international community to Yemen. And this is one of the ways to send the message of the magnitude of the problems there. You know, maybe you cannot do everything. We don't have the resources to do everything, but, you know, we could start somewhere and do something about that.
Thank you, Jihan. I have 4 people who've asked to speak: Hanan, and then Qais, and then Dan Serwer, and Ali Salahi. So, Hanan, faddali.
Thank you for the presentation. Actually, I have 2 comments here. As we know that in situation in Yemen, before the crisis, you know, we are struggling in disbursement the funds in the current projects. As we know that, you know, the Geneva last conference that they committed to provide 1.1 billion for Yemen. How can we make sure that we can distribute of these funds and, you know, provide the services? This is one. Second one, also in Yemen, you know, before the crisis that we have developed many development projects. But the issue with this that we are struggling in, once the project life cycle finished, then no sustainability, which is the key point of the development is the sustainability and continue even without donors funds. How can, you know, we start focus on this approach? How can, even with the conflict, that we can start support this development project and make it sustainable? Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Qais.
Thank you very much for the speakers. Okay, I will start with the statement that we agree on. Yemen is in conflict. My colleague just mentioned that Yemen has been classified before the conflict as a fragile state. I'm afraid, as a matter of fact, by international standard, Yemen has always been a fragile state. It's not a traditional state. And I don't know, when we talk about the capacity of the Yemeni government, if we also need to talk about the capacity of the donors in dealing with the situation there. I think there is an argument for development in Yemen. Maybe all of us agree here that development need to be continued. There are two interesting points that have been raised. The pipeline of funds. As a matter of fact, you know, the USAID, the EU, and many other organizations in the past and now have allocated funds for Yemen. And for a long time, the case is that the funds are not dispersed. And the reason, there is no capacity. And this is a dilemma. So I think at this point, where the funds are where are the funds are going to come from is not relevant. Because if we have an experience in the past where funds have not been dispersed, and after the conflict, if it ever ends, we will have even a bigger problem in terms of absorption capacity. We need to realize that the absorption capacity, one of the problems is the donors also contributed to, is in the past they have forced development into Yemen. They have came in with, you know, their ideas of development, starting with, you know, the big investment projects and ending with a very small local level, interventions, both ends. You know, so in the middle they ignored the government, they ignored the authorities. They have always, you know, we all applaud the social fund for development, It's a great institution. There are many other ones that are not, they are, not government, but they are government at the end. So why did the social fund succeed and whether the governments did not? We should ask this question, because a lot of support was provided to the social fund, to the PWP and others, but not to the government. I have seen myself, I've worked in development for over 20 years, and they have evaluated numerous projects, including World Bank, EU. They come up with an idea: we need to do restructuring. They go to the ministry, you need to do restructuring. They force it on them. And the end is disastrous. We just, we say, okay, we need decentralization. Decentralization needs to start from the bottom, not from up. You need to build capacity at the local level and then work it up, not, restructure the top and then you have nothing at the end. You don't have no central authority and you have no local authority. So I think these are issues that need to be brought as we move on, because if we continue to development the way it's being done, maybe it's better if we don't do it. If we're talking about blueprints, again, I applaud my friend for bringing the issue. Who was consulted in this effort? Were there a lot of Yemenis consulted, a lot of locals consulted to see what are their priorities? We cannot sit here and prescribe the solution for the local Yemenis. We have to go there. Many organizations are doing it. At this point, GIZ is working. They have their office, they have their staff, and they are working. UNDP, UNICEF, why not others? If the donors are not in the ground, they just receive reports. They don't know what's reality. They don't know how much is accurate. And I will tell you, not more than 10 to 20% of what you receive is accurate. Not more than that. The list is just words, nothing in the ground. So I urge all donors to be more realistic, to talk to the people, involve locals, whether they are, now under Houthi, whatever, because we are talking about the technocrats who are going to do it, and we need to support them for the future. We do not have to give them money. I realize that this is not acceptable. I realize the fiduciary cost, risk, and other issues that the donors have to deal with, but also they have to deal with realities and also support what could be a future of development of Yemen.
Thank you, Mr. Iriani. Mr. Dan Serwer has disappeared. Mr. Al-Salahi.
Thank you, Dr. Salim. The absorption capacity and the developmental programs and these topics are old, and they have been discussed so many times before the war. So we have new realities now on ground, and I hope the building or the developmental program might happen with the reconstruction after the reconstruction programs after when the war is over. Now we have serious issues, and it touch base with the ordinary peoples. We have a shortage of medicine, food, and electricity, and cash. And we have another issue which is serious enough to make those problems even worse, which is the black market. We know this war created a black market in Sana'a and some part of the Houthi-controlled areas. And there are a lot of people are getting rich out of this market. And even the envoy, Mr. Sheikh, mentioned this recently. He said there are some warring parties. They are getting benefit out of this war. They are getting cash. And how can we tackle this issue, the black market? How can we establish a distribution channels for cash without those who are corrupted people?
Thank you. Thank you. Let me turn to the panelists for their closing comments. Jihan?
Just a quick comments. I think as a Yemeni, the first thing when I hear the Geneva pledges, I was like, I hope they're gonna put it all in a fund and pay salaries. Because no matter what programs they're gonna create, if people, they don't have the purchasing power, if they are deciding to, just distribute food or do whatever, at the end of the day, it's, if you really are able to reach the civil servants in Yemen, that's the biggest humanitarian support you will be able to deliver to the Yemenis. So that was my first impression when I hear the figure of it. I think sustainability will always be an issue. Not only Yemen struggling with it, it's many countries are struggling with it, and I don't think there will be an immediate solution for that. I totally agree with you. Observative capacity has been always an issue, will continue to be an issue. We do need, that's why I said it's important to think about the how, not only the what, because it's how are we going to implement. People need to see tangible results, quick results too. So that's something that will always need to be discussed and find ways to do it, creative ways to do it. But I think we will need still to find ways to support the national institutions. Because no matter what, if we need to do good, at least if we can, we don't need to do harm, but at least we need to push ourselves to do good, and the best way to do it is through our national institutions. Black market, this is a big issue, unless we could resolve the exchange rates, because even as we speak now, there is always a macroeconomic issues, and can we float the currency, or how we're going to do with it. But unless we resolve that, even the aid that's going to Yemen, it's going to be affected by the exchange rate currently in Yemen. And who's benefiting from it? It's not the Yemeni people, it's the small group of basically elites who are benefiting from this black market or the exchange rates. And the longer this conflict it will take for it to be resolved, the more groups we'll be dealing with. At the beginning of the conflict, we knew who we're dealing with. There was the legitimate government, the Houthis, the Saleh. But now, as there is a proliferation of groups, whether local groups and others, that will continue disturbing whether it's distorting the market, but also creating security issues on the ground. So, hope that there was a silver bullet for it, but I don't think there will be, but we still need to think through them. Don't want to miss, Qais, I think you raised a very, very important issues there about why SFD is working the way it is, but not the local institution. I think, yes, it is the sustained support, but it's also the structure of these organizations. SFD are able to hire their own people. They are able to select their own people. They were able to build their own capacities, and to work within certain number of human capital. But for the public institution, that was very, very difficult. Many of the Yemenis are basically hired in the public sector, and the question is, at that point, or always question that. And in any civil servants, do we really need the amount of people? Do we need that kind of qualification? What do we need to have an effective civil servant or national institution? But this is not even the question now, because now is the reality on the ground is totally different. We do need to deal with whatever we have and make the best out of it.
How do I say this? I mean, we can't criticize what a lot of the donors have done. Honestly, they have, the international community has contributed hundreds of millions of dollars to Yemen. They have, the Saudis have contributed through the King Salman Center hundreds of millions of dollars, the Emiratis. I mean, I think there is truly a lot of compassion being showed to Yemen. But there's something missing, because it's insufficient or inadequate, or it's not moving fast enough, or It's not supporting local organizations. So we've got a lot to work on. And all these questions, all these points on absorption capacity and corruption and capacity of donors, I mean, they've all got some merit. We need to address those. But on the other hand, you know, people are contributing. But to activate even more, larger amounts and more action on Yemen, you know, there's got to be a higher intensity of international and local leadership, constant. And I think this is what we see on Iraq. We see the Iraqis, advocating on their behalf. We see a coalition that is preoccupied with ISIS, being energized to do more. We see international leadership circulating throughout the world, touching base at capitals, bringing people together to discuss issues. It's constant. You know, when you compare what's happening in Yemen, on the Yemen subject, and what's happening on the subject of Iraq or Syria, for that matter, it's something to work towards, elevating the level of attention. That's not to say that there isn't, a special envoy that's not working 24/7, a staff that's not working 24/7, His Excellency the Ambassador working 24/7. A lot of people, working day in and day out on the Yemen issue. It's just that it's gotta coalesce some way, better than it has, I think. But I hate to criticize it at the same time. Yeah, all these comments are valid, and we need to work on them.
Well, I want to thank both panelists, a very rich, very detailed, very real session. Thank you both. Please join me in thanking our two panelists. We'll move straight to the last short session. I turn to my colleague, Christian Koch, to lead us through this last shorter session.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. It was a very rich session, the last one, and overall, let me first of all thank everybody today for all their comments, for all the speakers, for all the presentations we had. I think we had an extremely rich discussion overall. I think in that sense it was very useful, but of course it also highlighted how complex many of these issues are, and the kind of complexity that we face in dealing with the various areas that we talked about. And I can just, I'm not here to try to summarize everything. I wouldn't even be possible. But just to highlight some of these complexities, as we had this debate about the need for local ownership versus the need for also reestablishing the state and having centralized institutions working. We had this debate about leverage needed on the parties on the ground to fulfill many of the obligations that are out there. At the same time, though, when we also have either a certain indifference or a certain inability by the international community to want to exert that kind of leverage that might be needed. We had the discussion about the humanitarian solutions that are needed, but how can we actually propose many of these solutions at the same time that we continue to have an extremely difficult political process that is not allowing a lot of times the space needed for solutions to be implemented on the ground. We just had the discussion about the development programs and assistance programs that are out there, then versus sort of the absorptive capacities and dealing with institutions at the same time, maybe that the capacities are declining. And then sort of finally what struck me a little bit is, of course, in the end of the day, it's going to be the people on the ground, it's going to be the Yemenis who are going to be implementing the final solutions and bringing about a peaceful settlement to the conflict. But at the same time, we also see that there are many issues and many problems out there that are just so tremendous and so large that there's also going to be the need for the international community to be involved and to provide the assistance where at times Yemeni institutions would still fall short. So I think we'd had a really great discussion a lot on the what, but we need to continue focusing on the how. I think that already stuck out to me as well in the discussions. I felt, and also the Middle East Institute, we all agreed on the fact that I just didn't want to end the discussions today with the last panel and then everybody go home, but maybe just take this opportunity and allow everybody around the table, and especially also, of course, our participants from the Yemeni side, to focus maybe just a little bit more in the next 10, 15, 20 minutes sort of on the how, and to get us out of here with a set sort of things that we can continue to work on, that we can continue to develop and see what can be implemented. It's also the goal of us at the Gulf Research Center to not just have an academic debate and then everything stays in the room where we want it, and that was the idea of also entitling this workshop a little bit, finding the way forward of what can be done next. And as I said at the beginning this morning, in my initial remarks, is we're going to continue to have these discussions. This is one of these workshops we are holding here in Washington, but we're going to continue to do this also in Europe and dealing with other external actors and other institutions into seeing how we can continue to move that debate forward. So I'm just going to basically just open the floor to people, and if anybody has a final comment or final recommendation to be made, I think that would be extremely useful, because that allows us to focus ourselves as we continue going to be debating this issue, the various issues that define Yemen as we go forward. So the floor is open.
Thank you so much. Well, how is the most important questions, how to get out of this mess. On the political side, I would say we need to come together to a political consensus, national political consensus outside the government. How can we reach that? We need a technocrat government, 15 ministers, and they should be technocrat. They should work from Sana'a. We need a security and military council, 9 representatives from those who have not been engaged in the war, professionals, and they should be working from Sana'a. This government, small government, and the national council should focus on services, economics, and humanitarian issue, and the warring for 2 years. And they should organize the issue of the militia, how to de-weaponize the militia, how to keep security, and how to maintain peace in Sana'a and surrounding areas. Then the warring parties, the Saleh's party, Houthis, the Joint Meetings Party, and the hierarchies should sit outside of the government. They have 2 years to form a political solutions, and when they come to an agreement, they should form a national unity government to observe election. This is this is basically what I would suggest.
الحقيقة شكرا للجميع، يعني مركز الشرق الأوسط ومركز الخليج للأبحاث على هذه الورشة القيمة في الحقيقة التي لامست كثير من الألم وحول المشكلة اليمنية القائمة. لكن إن كان من كلمة أخيرة نود أن نلخص فيها جزء من الحلول.
For some of the solutions, I think that diagnosis of the problem is half of the solution.
لا يمكن بأن نعالج مشكلة بناء على تشخيص خاطئ أو تقديري ليس صحيح. يفترض بأي حل لأي قضية أن تشخص بشكل صحيح بعيد عن العواطف وبعيد عن المزايدات.
Of the problem and read the reality accurately and depends on two things in Yemen. First, the historical dimension. Must the Yemeni issue should not the historical base is very important for any Yemeni issue. Getting away from history is not going to work with the Yemeni people. The other thing is the culture of society. We are here in the United States of America discussing matters with mentalities that is different. Many people do not understand the local culture of our society. How do they think? What is the composition of the society? And the methods of the people in dealing with decisions that are made abroad. So they assume that any solution should not really be done without taking these two factors into consideration. During the historical periods in the past, with regard to Yemeni issues, and before and after 1990, the solutions were always given by the elite, including the National Dialogue Conference, which they made all of our issues an elite problems. Our problem is a societal problem, and the simple citizen must be part of the solution. He must bear responsibility, because the continued failure should not be done again, because it's going to lead us to another disaster. We must be able to diagnose the status of our community very accurately, even if we don't like it, because any solutions based on mistakes will lead to mistakes, such as it happened in the past. We have seen that with the Ali Abdullah Saleh and the problem during his time. And the victims were the Yemeni people who are in war now for years. Now if we rely on the acceptance of the society for the solutions, will lead us to a great catastrophe. So the Yemeni problem must be diagnosed correctly. The Yemeni elites politically and militarily have failed in the past. So the United Nations and the donor states and our major partners, including the United States and the European Union, must be a principal part of any equation. And the last point I want to talk about is that Yemen was a theater for political messages on the region. The Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, getting these countries from any negotiations, direct will create other problems. These people are the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that provided a lot of help to Yemen, was and will continue to be the very effective element in Yemen. So ignoring her directly will lead to a result that is not good. Also Iran, who is standing behind the militias and is accepted in many areas, in Sana'a and other cities, we should have international pressure on Iran to accept these political solutions and a real commitment, not on paper only, because we, the people like the Yemeni people, more than 30 million people, will face another war, and we lose 40 to 50,000 people and destruction of cities. And the position of the Yemeni people, educational and economic, is very difficult under natural circumstances.
Thank you for that. Dr. Argonaid.
We are paranoid right now in Yemen. I'm very suspicious of everyone and everything. I'm telling you the state of affairs with our people. This is number one. Number two, I am modest, and I want something practical to come from this workshop. So I want few messages to come from this workshop to send my people home. First message, send a message to people of Yemen that they are not forgotten. That's because we think that the world has forgotten us. Number two, tell people that you support the three references to solve the problem of Yemen. Because I can talk about this, they have doubts that the world is still supporting these three references because of the things that they keep pampered with statements from every corner. And not only statements, also with actual acts on the ground. I'm not going to go to them. If you want, I can. Enumerate for the third message, tell them, enumerate things that you feel sorry about and you are going to do something about it. The forcibly disappeared, the siege of ties. There are so many things they have been mentioned already. They are already recorded during the different panels. Tell them, this is the last message, this is only a first step. And you will follow them, will come up with more steps to help them. I think they need to hear this. All other things are good, but they are beyond the immediate expectation of such workshop. Thank you.
Thank you for that. John Duke.
Yes, my ideas or principles and ideals have already been overtaken because they may be in the marketplace of ideas. Please forgive me, but I'm not aware that they have been. There are 28 of us here sitting around this table. The division is roughly half and half. 14 Americans, 14 Yemenis. Along the lines of doing something that will at least have optical value, but also not raise expectations unduly. Why not, amongst the 28 of us here, agree to give at least serious and favorable consideration to the following: that we form amongst the 28 a de facto coalition, network, organization. We don't have to incorporate. Doesn't have to be official. I would invite the ambassador perhaps to be at least the honorary chairperson of this, not an American. We're talking about addressing local needs. So we go at it from the inside out, not from the outside in. Here, we're all on the outside. So we have to have the inside be with the upper hand. They know their needs. They know their concerns. They know their interests. They know their goals. They know their aspirations, all of which are legitimate. We outsiders, at best, guess, make assumptions. We don't need to guess, make assumptions here. And for us to meet again on, let's say, October the 20th, my organization, we have a conference on October 18, 19. We have a formal agreement with the Gulf Research Center, which could be the non-Yemeni element in this. Middle East Institute has organized and administered this. We'd be willing and happy to play a role in any way. That would be something, sir, to send back home as a result of this meeting. Don't raise expectations unduly. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. But at least we can meet. We can follow up on this. There'll be a harakah of our ideas and consensuses. So I sort of move that for consideration. Otherwise, we're all busy people. We're pulled in this or that direction. It is easy to say, yes, we'll do this, but we forget or we miss the date. I would like to propose that we do work with you, Paul, and Ambassador Chamberlain, and Christopher, and yourself, sir, on the government side, but the ambassador here guide us in terms of your needs, your concerns, your interests. Don't let us assume or guess. I don't know whether to make this in the form of a motion. I will, but it would need somebody to second it, and I'd be happy to work with anybody for this, so that we don't leave here and say, well, oh, that was great, but it becomes a memory within a week or so. No, these issues are too important, humanistically and otherwise. I'll shut up.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Mr. Najee.
Realistically speaking, I think we all know that the Yemen conflict is a part of a larger conflict that's probably is not going to be solved anytime soon. So I think the only practical matters that are available to us is to break down the conflict and have little successes here and there. Number one, which is the sister just mentioned, is pay the people, which was the fund that she spoke about. I wish that fund will be used to pay people so they could go on with their lives. Maybe ending Ta'ez siege. That's another action that could be used. That's a small battle that can be used. And since there's a State Department officials here, maybe easing the way for Yemenis who are trying to come here, for those people who are, they meet all the requirements. Just make it easier for them so they, just like I spoke earlier, they could be more helping in this larger issue. I think realistically speaking, those are the only practical that we could think of. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there any other Kais, please?
I spoke too much, sorry. Okay, I would be more optimistic and give 3 recommendations, maybe to somebody, somebody here. On the political side, I would say focus on regional, players rather than the local, because this is where the money comes from. The second thing is, of course, establish an alternative, strengthen the government, establish an alternative for people in Yemen so the people move from the Houthi areas to whatever, new places, Marib or Aden, some place that is safe and people could have a good life. On the humanitarian side, do more now and focus on long-term solutions as well. On the development side, do more, find alternatives to finance. We cannot say there's only the SFD and they are overwhelmed and we cannot do anything. There are always ways to establish new organizations, to find ways such as the UNDP and GIZ have found. So with that, I do support the idea brought to form a coalition and also meet if that's going to help. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Over there.
صراحة مجيئنا إلى هنا من أجل حلول عامة لليمن، ومثل ما قال الأخ على أن نخرج من هذا المكان بإيجاد حلول للقضية اليمنية بشكل عام شمالا وجنوبا وشرقيا.
Yemen problem in general in all its parts.
لأن الحرب لا يمكن أن تستمر.
Because the war cannot continue. It could continue 10 and 15 years, but the Houthis and Saleh would be defeated. There should be a dialogue between the legitimate authorities and the movement, the activists in the south. Nobody should be excluded, not from the middle of the country. If they are excluded, and so that will not help the cooperation. So that should be helped by the sponsorship of the Saudi Arabian government. We should come out with Yemeni solutions, regional solutions sponsored by, also supported by American.
أنا من المقاومة الجنوبية أو
I am from the southern part. The south has to be liberated. The south has been liberated from Saleh's forces and the Houthis, and thanks to the efforts by the Americans and the Arab coalition, they provided the support, but they didn't support the southern resistance. That resistance annihilated the Qaeda forces and the rebels from the Houthis, and now we have to cooperate and have a dialogue between the southern resistance and the legitimate government and those who had the coup d'etat in Sana'a. So we had talked with them from Geneva to Oman and to other places, but the southern resistance was excluded, but now should be included with all its organizations and entities that had cooperated in liberating the South. We should come out from this place after finding an idea for solutions in Yemen. My question is to the sister here. Is the central bank in Ma'rib can send any funds to the central bank in Aden? Would that be the only place? The Hudaida would be the first port there, and I mean the legitimate government proved that the central bank is the state bank. Would all the resources be directed there? Many financial institutions, European, American, or in the Gulf, give assistance to Yemen, but through banks that Ali Abdul Saleh is still a partner in these banks. This is the commercial bank and Saba Islamic Bank, the many banking systems and the Sarafa exchange, Safi exchange company. They were given millions of dollars, and they exported the money as smuggled out to the country. There no investigations were done, so we need to have a good solution for all this, and especially for the general solution for the whole Yemeni problem, including the cessation of the South. So this, we have to come out with that. I greet you all and bring you greetings of the whole Yemeni people to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Any more comments? More over there, please.
In the beginning, we have to thank the organizers. Thank you all. Second thing, in terms of effectiveness of interventions has always been an issue. And I think it is very important that you make sure that future intervention, effectiveness of intervention has always been an issue. Okay? And it is very important to do evaluation of the past intervention, which is very important. The second thing to do is you need to do also, let's say, rapid assessment for the operational capacities for example, the Social Fund for Development, for the Social Security Fund. Yes, they are there, and they can, do a lot of projects. So you need to do some rapid assessment for that. Again, for the people, for the last 10 months, people are not paid. And I think it's very important to pump some money into the economy to pay people, but we have to make sure that this money should not fall in the hands of Houthis to finance their war against Yemenis, okay? The other thing, I think we need to have an office or something like PRO which coordinate the different assistance. You can bring people from different organizations, including the donors, international organizations, and people from the Yemeni government. You bring them together, the best people, and these people should be tasked with coordinating any assistance to Yemen. Now for people, they need to see people who are, for example, in liberated provinces, regions. They need to see some hope. They need to see something, to see some future, okay? Because now, if they cannot see some light out of the, at the end of the tunnel, okay, it will be a little bit discouraging for them. So we need to do something. We need to do some interventions right now, like our ambassador said, you need to help. I mean, the international organizations, the USAID and other donors, they need to start working right now to help, in the liberated provinces and regions, so that people can see something new. Okay, the other point which is very important here, you need not to focus only on. We need to focus on programs and projects that bring the maximum impact, the maximum benefit to people. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Okay, I don't see any more, at the moment, any more interventions. So let me again thank everybody for those. I think those were excellent comments to finish off the day. Very useful overall. In the end, before I turn it back to Paul, all I can really say is to thank you all for coming. Thank for all the speakers for their comments and all the questions that were raised. A special thanks on behalf of the Gulf Research Center to Ambassador Chamberlain, the Middle East Institute, for your immediate readiness to associate with us on this program. I know it was a little bit of short notice, but your cooperation, as always, is excellent, and it's very much appreciative. And I look forward to continuing many of these discussions that we held here today. So thank you very much. Paul, please.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. These proceedings are also being recorded, so maybe we hope to get like a report. Maybe we'll work on it jointly. Maybe we could also consider, after the report, maybe a joint statement or something. That's something we can consider. We would certainly welcome, a future meeting on Yemen. That's something we always want to be doing. We responded immediately, and any cooperation we can find would be a great idea. From our end here as a Washington think tank, these discussions feed directly into our work, which is in Washington, interacting always with the media that are based here and influencing opinion. It feeds directly into our interactions, whether it's in the White House or on the Hill in Congress and with others. So we try to take this directly and try to impact. We also have track 2 meetings with Iranian officials, with Russian officials, with Saudi officials, with others. And we will also carry some of these messages directly there as well. So for us, this directly feeds into our work, and we hope to directly have some impacts in the things at least that we do. I want on my behalf to thank Christian Koch from the Gulf Research Center, and please convey our regards to our dear friend Abdulaziz Al-Sagar. Obviously, thank you all for coming. It was short notice that we told you about this meeting, so thanks for participating. I want to thank our translators who I think tried to keep up with very fast-speaking speakers. And I want to thank our own team at the Middle East Institute, Jessica and the events management team, and Scott Zuki and the communications team who are recording everything. Thank you all for being here. Yemen is a key issue for us. Unfortunately, as Ambassador Chamberlain said, Ambassador Firestein usually carries this file 24/7, as you mentioned, Bob, and we will be briefing him on everything that happened today, and we'll see you again, inshallah, soon. Thank you.